Killing Floor, Lee Child, Chapter 1. I was arrested in Eno's diner at 12 o'clock. I was eating eggs and drinking coffee. A late breakfast, not lunch. I was wet and tired after a long walk in heavy rain, all the way from the highway to the edge of town. The diner was small but bright and clean, brand new, built to resemble a converted railroad car. Narrow, with a long lunch counter on one side and a kitchen bumped out back. Booths lining the opposite wall. A doorway where the center booth would be. I was in a booth at a window, reading somebody's abandoned newspaper about the campaign for a president I didn't vote for last time and wasn't going to vote for this time. Outside, the rain has stopped, but the glass was still pebbled with bright drops. I saw the police cruisers pulled into the gravel lot. They were moving fast and crunched to a stop. Light bars flashing and popping. Red and blue light in the raindrops on my window. Doors burst open. Policemen jumped out, 2 from each car, weapons ready. 2 revolvers, 2 shotguns. This was heavy stuff. 1 revolver, 1 shotgun ran to the back. One of each rushed the door. I just sat and watched them. I knew who was in the diner. A cook in back, 2 waitresses, 2 old men, and me. This operation was for me. I had been in town less than a half hour. The other 5 had probably been here all their lives. Any problem with any of them, and an embraced sergeant would have shuffled in. He would be apologetic. He would mumble to them. He would ask them to come down to the station house. So the heavy weapons and the rush weren't for any of them. They were for me. I crammed egg into my mouth and trapped a fly under the plate. Folded the abandoned newspaper into a square and shoved it into my coat pocket. Kept my hands above the table and drained my cup. The guy with the revolver stayed at the door. He went into a crouch and pointed the weapon two-handed at my head. The guy with the shotgun approached close. These were fit, lean boys, neat and tidy, textbook moves. The revolver at the door could cover the room with a degree of accuracy. The shotgun up close could spatter me all over the window. The other way around would be a mistake. A revolver could miss in a close-quarters struggle, and a long-range shotgun blast from the door would kill the arresting officer and the old guy in the rear booth as well as me. So far, they were doing it right, no doubt about that. They had the advantage. No doubt about that either. The tight booth trapped me. I was too hemmed in to do much. I spread my hands on the table. The officer with the shotgun came near. "Freeze! Police!" he screamed. He was screaming as loud as he could, blowing off his tension and trying to scare me. Textbook moves. Plenty of sound and fury to soften the target. I raised my hands. The guy with the revolver started in front of the door. The guy with the shotgun came closer, too close. Their first terror. If I had to, I might have lunged for the shotgun barrel and forced it up. A blast into the ceiling perhaps, an elbow to the policeman's face, and the shotgun could have been mine. The guy with the revolver had narrowed his angle and couldn't risk hitting his partner. It could have ended badly for them, but I just sat there, hands raised. The guy with the shotgun was still screaming and jumping. "Out here on the floor," he yelled. I slid slowly out of the booth and extended my wrist to the officer with the revolver. As I wasn't going to lie on the floor, not for these country boys. Not if they brought along their whole police department with howitzers. The guy with the revolver was a sergeant. He was pretty calm. The shotgun covered me as the sergeant holstered his revolver and unclipped the handcuff from his belt and clicked them on my wrist. The backup team came in through the kitchen. They walked around the lunch counter, took up position behind me. They patted me down, very thorough. I saw the sergeant acknowledge the shake of the heads. No weapon. The backup guy each took an elbow. The shotgun still covered me. The sergeant stepped in front of me. He was a compact, athletic white man, lean and tanned, my age. The acetate nameplate above his shirt pocket said Baker. He looked up at me. You are under arrest for murder, he said. You have right to remain silent. Anything you say may be used as evidence against you. You have the right to representation by an attorney. Should you be unable to afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you by the state of Georgia, free of charge. Do you understand these rights? It was a fine rendition of Miranda. He spoke clearly. He didn't read it from a card. He spoke like he knew what it meant and why it was important. To him and to me, I didn't respond. Do you understand your rights? He said again. Again, I didn't respond. Long experience had taught me that absolute silence is the best way. Say something and it can be misheard, misunderstood, misinterpreted. It can get you convicted. It can get you killed. Silence upsets the arresting officer. He has to tell you silence is your right, but he hates it if you exercise that right. I was being arrested for murder, but I said nothing. Do you understand your rights? The guy called Becker asked me again. Do you speak English? He was calm. I said nothing. He remained calm. He had the calm of a man whose moment of danger had passed. He could just drive me to the station house and then I would become someone else's problem. He glanced round his three fellow officers. Okay, make a note. He said nothing. He grunted. Let's go. I was walking towards the door. At the door, we formed a single file. First Baker, then the guy with the shotgun, walking backward, still with a big black barrel pointing at me. His nameplate said Stevenson. He too was a medium white man in good shape. His weapon looked like drain pipe, pointing at my gut. Behind me were the backup guys. I was pushed through the door with a hand flat on my back. Outside in the gravel lot, the heat was up. It must have rained all night and most of the morning. Now the sun was blasting away and the ground was steaming. Normally this would be a dusty hot place. Today it was steaming with that wonderful heady aroma of drenched pavement under the hot noon sun. I stood face up to the sun and inhaled as the officers regrouped, one at each elbow for the short walk to the cars. Stevenson still on the ball with the pump action. At the first car, he skipped backward a step as Baker opened the rear door. My head was pushed down. I was nudged into the car with a neat hip-to-hip contact from the left-hand backup. Good moves. In a town this far from anywhere, surely the result of lot of training rather than lot of experience. I was alone in the back of a car. A thick glass partition divided the space. The front doors were still open. Baker and Stevenson got in. Baker drove. Stevenson was twisted around, keeping me under observation. Nobody asked. The backup car followed. The cars were new, quiet and smooth riding, clean and cool inside. No ingrained traces of desperate and pathetic people riding where I was riding. I looked out of the window. Georgia. I saw rich land, heavy, damp red earth. Very long and straight rows of low bushes in the field. Peanuts maybe, belly crops, but valuable to the grower or to the owner. Did people own their land here or did giant corporations? I didn't know. The drive to town was short. The car hissed over the smooth soft tarmac. After maybe half mile, I saw two neat buildings, both new, both with tidy landscaping. The police station and the firehouse. They stood alone together. Behind a white lawn with a statue, north edge of town. Attractive county architecture on a generous building budget. Roads were smooth tarmac, sidewalks were red blocks. 300 yards south, I could see a building, white church steeple, behind a small huddle of buildings. I could see flagpoles, awnings, crisp paint, green lawns, everything refreshed by the heavy rain, now steaming and somehow intense in the heat. A prosperous community. Stevenson still stared at me as the car slowed to yaw into the approach to the station house, a wide semicircle of driveway. I read on a low masonry sign, Margrave Police Headquarters. I thought, should I be worried? I was under arrest in a town where I would been never before, and apparently for murder. But I knew two things. First, they couldn't prove something had happened if it hadn't had happened. And second, I hadn't killed anybody. Not in their town and not for a long time anyway. Chapter 2. We pulled up at the doors of the long, low building. Becker got out of the car and looked up and down along the frontage. The backup guys stood by. Stevenson walked around the back of our car, took up a position opposite Becker, pointed the shotgun at me. This was a good team. Becker opened my door. Okay, let's go, he said, almost a whisper. He was bouncing on the balls of his feet, scanning the area. I pivoted slowly and twisted out of the car. The handcuffs didn't help, even hotter now. I stepped forward and waited. The backup fell in behind me. Ahead of me was the station house entrance. There was a long marble lintel crisply engraved, Town of Margrave Police Headquarters. Below it were plate glass doors. Becker pulled one open. It sucked against rubber seals. The backup pushed me through. The door stuck shut behind me. Inside it was cool again. Everything was white and chrome. Lights were fluorescent. It looked like a bank or an insurance office. There was a carpet. A desk sergeant stood behind a long reception counter. The way the place looked, he should have said, "How may I help you, sir?" But he said nothing. He just looked at me. Behind him was a huge open plan space. A dark-haired woman in uniform was sitting at a wide, low desk. She had been doing paperwork on a keyboard. Now she was looking at me. I stood there, an officer on each elbow. Stevenson was backed up against the reception counter. His shotgun was pointed at me. Becker stood there looking at me. The desk sergeant and the woman in uniform were looking at me. I looked back at them. Then I was walked to the left. They stopped me in front of a door. Baker swung it open and I was pushed into a room. It was an interview facilities. No windows, a white table and 3 chairs, carpet. In the top corner of the room, a camera. The air in the room was set very cold. I was still wet from the rain. I stood there and Becker ferreted into every pocket. My belongings made a small pile on the table. A roll of cash, some coins, receipts, tickets, scraps. Becker checked the newspaper and left it in my pocket, glanced at my watch and left it in my wrist. He wasn't interested in those things. Everything else was swept into a large Ziploc bag, a bag made for people with more in their pockets than I carry. The bag had a white panel printed on it. Stevenson wrote some kind of number on the panel. Becker told me to sit down. Then they all left the room. Stevenson carried the bag with my stuff in it. They went out and closed the door. I heard the lock turning. I had a very heavy, well-greased sound. The sound of precision. The sound of big steel lock. Sounded like a lock that would keep me in. I figured they would leave me isolated for a while. It usually happens that way. Isolation causes an urge to talk. An urge to talk can become an urge to confess. A brutal arrest followed by an hour's isolation is pretty good strategy. But I figured wrong. They hadn't planned an hour's isolation. Maybe their second slight tactical mistake. Becker unlocked the door and stepped back in. He carried a plastic cup of coffee. Then he signaled the uniformed woman into the room, the one I had seen at her desk in the open area. The heavy lock clicked behind her. She carried a metal flight case which she set on the table. She clicked it open and took out a long black number holder. In it were white plastic numbers. She handed it to me with the brisk apologetic sympathy that dental nurses use. I took it in my cuff's hand, squinted down to make sure it was the right way up, and held it under my chin. The woman took an ugly camera out of the case and sat opposite me. She rested her elbows on the table to brace the camera, sitting forward. Her breast rested on the edge of the table. This was a good-looking woman. Dark hair, great eyes. I stared at her and smiled. The camera clicked and flashed. Before she could ask, I turned sideways on the chair for the profile, held the long number against my shoulder, and stared at the wall. The camera clicked and flashed again. I turned back and held out the number, two-handed, because of the cuffs. She took it from me with the pursed grin which said, "Yes, it's unpleasant, but it is necessary," like the dental nurse. Then she took out the fingerprint gear, the crisp 10 card already labeled with a number. The thumb spaces are always too small. This one had a reverse side with two squares of palm prints. The handcuffs made the process difficult. Becker didn't offer to remove them. The woman inked my hands. Her fingers were smooth and cool, no wedding band. Afterward, she handed me a wad of tissue. The ink came off very easily, some kind of new stuff I hadn't seen before. The woman uploaded the camera, put the film with the prints card on the table. She repacked the camera into the flight case. Becker rapped on the door. The lock clicked again. The woman picked up her stuff. Nobody spoke. The woman left the room. Becker stayed in there with me. He shut the door and it locked with the same graced click. Then he leaned on the door and looked at me. "My chief's coming on down," he said. "You are going to have to talk to him. We got a situation here. Got to be cleared up." I said nothing back to him. Talking to me wasn't going to clear any situation up for anybody. But the guy was acting civilized, respectful. So I set him a test, held out my hands towards him. An unspoken request to unlock the cuffs. He stood still for a moment and then took out the key and unlocked them, clipped them back on his belt, looked at me. I looked back and dropped my arms to my side. No grateful exhalation, no rueful rubbing of my wrist. I didn't want a relationship with this guy, but I did speak. "Okay," I said, "let's go meet your chief." It was the first time I had spoken since ordering breakfast. Now Becker was the one who looked grateful. He rapped twice on the door, and it was unlocked from the outside. He opened it up and signaled me through. Stevenson was waiting with his back to the large open area. The shotgun was gone. The backup crew was gone. Things were calming down. They formed up, one on each side. Becker gripped my elbow lightly. We walked down the side of the open area and came to the door at the back. Stevenson pushed it open and we walked through into a large office. Lots of rosewood all over it. A fat guy sat at a big rosewood desk. Behind him were a couple of big flags. There was a stars and stripes with gold fringe on the left, and what I guessed was the Georgia state flag on the right. On the wall between the flags, I figured it must be the clock from whatever old station house they bulldozed to build this new place. I figured the architect has used it to give a sense of history to the new building. It was showing nearly 12:30. The fat guy at the big desk looked up at me as I was pushed in towards him. I saw him look blank, like he was trying to place me. He looked again, harder. Then he sneered at me and spoke in a wheezing gasp which would have been a shout if it hadn't been strangled by bad lungs. "Get your ass in that chair and keep your filthy mouth shut," he said. This fat guy was a surprise. He looked like a real asshole, opposite to what I have seen so far. Becker and his arrest team were the business, professional and efficient. The fingerprint woman had been decent, but this fat police chief was a waste of space. Thin, dirty hair, sweating despite the chilly air. The blotchy red and grey complexion of an unfit, overweight mess. The blood pressure sky high, arteries hard as rocks. He didn't look halfway competent. "My name is Morrison," he wheezed, as if I cared. "I am chief of the police department down here in Margrave, and you are a murdering outside bastard. You have come down here to my town and you have messed up right there on Mr. Cleaner's private property. So now you are going to make a full confession to my chief of detectives." He stopped and looked up at me, like he was still trying to place me, or like he was waiting for a response. He didn't get one, so he jabbed his fat finger at me. "And then you are going to jail," he said. "And then you are going to the chair. And then I am going to take a dump on your shitty little pauper's grave." He hauled his bulk out of chair and looked away from me. "I would deal with this myself," he said, "but I am busy, man." He waddled out from behind the desk. I was standing there between his desk and the door. As he crept by, he stopped. His fat nose was about to level with the middle button on my coat. He was still looking up at me like he was puzzled by something. "I have seen you before," he said. "Where was it?" He glanced at Becker and then at Stevenson, like he was expecting them to note what he was saying. And when he was saying it, "I have seen this guy before," he told them. He slammed the office door and I was left waiting with the two cops until the chief of detectives swung in. A tall black guy, not old but graying and balding, just enough to give him patrician air, brisk and confident. Well dressed, in an old-fashioned tweed suit, moleskin vest, shined shoes. This guy looked like a chief should look. He signaled Becker and Stevenson out of the office, closed the door behind them, sat down at the desk and waved me to the opposite chair. He rattled open a drawer, pulled out a cassette recorder, raised it high, arm's length, to pull out tangle of codes, plugged in the power and the microphone, inserted a tape, pressed record and flicked the microphone with his fingernail, stopped the tape and wound it back, pressed play, heard the thunk of his nail, nodded, wound back again and pressed record. I sat and watched him. For a moment there was silence, just a faint hum, the air, the light, or the computer, or the recorder, whirring slowly. I could hear the slow tick of the old clock. It made a patient sound, like it was prepared to tick on forever, no matter what I chose to do. Then the guy sat right back in his chair and looked hard at me. Did his stippled finger things like tall, elegant people can? "Right," he said. "We got a few questions, don't we?" The voice was deep, like a rumble, not a southern accent. He looked and sounded like Boston banker, except he was black. "My name is Finley," he said. "My rank is captain. I am chief of this department's detective bureau. I understand you have been apprised of your rights. You have not yet confirmed that you understood them. Before we go any further, we must pursue that preliminary matter." Not a Boston banker, more like a Harvard guy. "I understand my rights," I said. He nodded. "Good," he said. I'm glad about that. Where is your lawyer? I don't need a lawyer, I said. You are charged with murder, he said. You need a lawyer. We'll provide one, free of charge. Do you want us to provide one free of charge? No, I don't need a lawyer, I said. The guy called Finley stared at me over his fingers for a long moment. Okay, he said, but you are going to have to sign a release. You have been advised you may have a lawyer, and we will provide one at no cost to yourself, but you absolutely don't want one. Okay, I said. He shuffled a form from another drawer and checked his watch to enter date and time. He slid the form across to me. A large printed cross marked the line where I was supposed to sign. He slid me a pen. I signed and slid the form back. He studied it, placed it in a buff folder. I can't read that signature, he said. So, for the record, we'll start with your name, your address, and your date of birth. There was a silence again. I looked at him. There was a stubborn guy, probably 45. You don't get to be a chief of detectives in Georgia jurisdiction if you are 45 and black. Except you are a stubborn guy. No percentage in jerking him around. I drew a breath. My name is Jack Reacher, I said. No middle name, no address. He wrote it down. Not much to write. I told him my date of birth. Okay, Mr. Richer, Finley said. As I said, we have lot of questions. I have glanced through your personal effects. You were carrying no ID at all. No driver's license, no credit cards, no nothing. You have no address, you say. So I'm asking myself, who is this guy? He didn't wait for any kind of comment on that from me. Who was the guy with the shaved head? He asked me. I didn't answer. I was watching the big clock, waiting for the minute hand to move. Tell me what happened, he said. I had no idea what had happened, no idea at all. Something had happened to somebody, but not to me. I sat there, didn't ask. What is pluribus? Finley asked. I looked at him and shrugged. The United States motto, I said, E pluribus unum, adopted in 1776 by the Second Continental Congress, right? He just grunted at me. I carried on looking straight at him. He figured this was a type of guy who might answer a question. What is this about? I asked him. Silence again. He turned to look at me. I could see him thinking about whether to answer and how. What is this about? I asked him again. He sat back and stippled his fingers. You know what this is about, he said. Homicide, with some very disturbing features. Victim was found this morning up at Cleaner Warehouse, north end of the country road, up at the highway Cloverleaf. Witness has reported a man seen walking away from that location shortly after 8 o'clock this morning. Description given was that of white man, very tall, wearing a long black overcoat, fair hair, no hat, no baggage. Silence again. I am a white man. I am very tall. My hair is fair. I was sitting there wearing a long black overcoat. I didn't have a hat or a bag. I had been walking on the country road for the best part of 4 hours this morning, from 8 until about 11:45. How long is the country road? He said. From the highway all the way down to here. Finley thought about it. Maybe 14 miles, I guess, he said. Right, I said. I walked all the way down from the highway into town. 14 miles maybe. Plenty of people must have seen me. Doesn't mean I did anything to anybody. He didn't respond. I was getting curious about his situation. Is that your neighborhood? I asked him. All the way over at the highway? Yes, it is, he said. Jurisdiction issue is clear. No way out for you there, Mr. Richen. The town limit extends 14 miles, right up to the highway. The warehousing out there is mine. No doubt about that. He waited. I nodded. He carried on. Cleaner built the place 5 years ago, he said. You heard of him? I shook my head. How should I have heard of him? I said. I have never been here before. He is a big deal around here, Finley said. His operation out there pays us a lot of taxes, does a lot of good, a lot of revenue, and a lot of benefit for the town without a lot of mess because it's so far away, right? So we tried to take care of it for him. But now it's homicide scene and you have got explaining to do. The guy was doing his job, but he was wasting my time. Okay, Finley, I said. I'll make a statement describing every little thing I did since I entered your lousy town limits until I got hauled in here in the middle of my damn breakfast. If you can make anything out of it, I'll give you a damn medal. Because all I did was to place one foot in front of the other for nearly 4 hours in the pouring rain all the way through your precision 14 damn miles. That was the longest speech I made for 6 months. Finlay sat and gazed at me. I watched him struggling with any detective's basic dilemma. His gut told him I might not be his man, but I was sitting right there in front of him. So what should a detective do? I let him ponder, tried to time it right with a nudge in the right direction. I was going to say something about the real guy still running around out there while he was wasting time in here with me. That would feed his insecurity, but he jumped first in the wrong direction. No statements, he said. I'll ask the questions and you will answer them. You are Jack Nunn Reacher. No address, no ID. What are you, a vagrant? I sighed. Today was Friday. The big clock showed it was already more than half over. This guy Finley was going to go through all the hoops with me. I was going to spend the weekend in a cell, probably get out on Monday. I'm not vagrant, Finley, I said. I'm a hobo. Big difference. He shook his head slowly. Don't get smart with me, Richard, he said. You are in deep shit. Bad things happened up there. Our witness saw you leaving the scene. You are a stranger with no ID and no story. So don't get smart with me. He was still just doing his job, but he was still wasting my time. I wasn't leaving a homicide scene, I said. I was walking down a damn road. There is difference, right? People leaving homicide scenes run and hide. They don't walk straight down the road. What's wrong about walking down a road? People walk down roads all the damn time, don't they? Finley leaned forward and shook his head. No, he said. Nobody has walked the length of that road since the invention of automobile. So why no address? Where are you from? Answer the questions. Let's get this done. Okay, Finley, let's get it done, I said. I don't have address because I don't live anywhere. Maybe one day I'll live somewhere and then I'll have an address. But I'll send you a picture postcard and you can put it in your damn address book. Since you seem so damn concerned about it. Finley gazed at me and reviewed his options. Elected to go the patient route, patient but stubborn, like he couldn't be deflected. Where are you from? He asked. What was your last address? What exactly do you mean when you say where I am from? I asked. His lips were clamped. I was getting him bad tempered too. But he stayed patient, laced with patience, with an icy sarcasm. Okay, he said. You don't understand my question. So let me try to make it clear. What I mean is, where were you born? Or where have you lived for that majority period of your life, which you instinctively regard as predominant in social or cultural context? I just looked at him. I'll give you an example, he said. I myself was born in Boston, was educated in Boston, and subsequently worked for 20 years in Boston. So I would say, and I think you would agree, that I come from Boston. I was right, a Harvard guy running out of patience. Okay, I said, you have asked the questions, I'll answer them. But let me tell you something. I'm not your guy. By Monday, you will know I'm not your guy. So do yourself a favor. Don't stop looking. Finley was fighting a smile. He nodded gravely. I appreciate your advice, he said, and your concern for my career. You are welcome, I said. Go on, he said. Okay, I said. According to your fancy definition, I don't come from anywhere. I come from a place called military. I was born on a US Army base in West Berlin. My old man was Marine Corps, and my mother was a French civilian he met in Holland. They got married in Korea. Finley nodded, made a note. I was a military kid, he said. Show me the list of US bases all around the world, and that's a list of where I lived. I did high school in 2 dozen different countries, and I did 4 years up in West Point. Go on, Finley said. I stayed in the army, I said. Military police. I served and lived in all those bases all over again. Then Finley, after 36 years of first being the officer's kid and then being an officer myself, suddenly there is no need for a great big army anymore because the Soviets has gone belly up. So hooray, we got the peace dividend, which for you means your taxes get spent on something else. But for me means I'm 36-year-old unemployed ex-military policeman getting called a vagrant by a smug civilian bastard who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the world I survived. He thought for a moment, wasn't impressed. Continue, he said. I shrugged at him. So right now I'm just enjoying myself, I said. Maybe eventually I'll find something to do. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll settle somewhere. Maybe I won't. But right now I'm not looking to. He nodded, jotted some more notes. When did you leave the army? He asked. 6 months ago, I said. April. Have you worked at all since then? He asked. You are joking, I said. When was the last time you looked for work? April, he mimicked. 6 months ago, I got this job. Well, good for you, Finley, I said. I couldn't think of anything else to say. Finley gazed at me for a moment. What have you been living on? He asked. What rank did you hold? Major, I said. They give you severance pay when they kick you out. Still got most of it. Trying to make it last, you know. A long silence. Finley drummed a rhythm with the wrong end of his pen. So let's talk about the last 24 hours, he said. I sighed. Now I was heading for trouble. I came up on the Greyhound bus, I said. Got off at the country road, 8 o'clock this morning. Walked down into town. Reached that diner, ordered breakfast. And I was eating it when you guys came by and hauled me in. You got business here? He asked. I shook my head. I'm out of work, I said. I haven't got any business anywhere. He wrote that down. Where did you get on the bus? He asked me. In Tampa, I said. Left at midnight last night. Tampa in Florida? He asked. I nodded. He rattled open another drawer, pulled out a Greyhound schedule, ripped it open and ran a long brown finger down a page. This was a very thorough guy. He looked across at me. That's an express bus, he said. Runs straight through north to Atlanta. Arrived there 9 o'clock in the morning. Doesn't stop here at 8. I shook my head. I asked the driver to stop, I said. He said he shouldn't, but he did. Stop specially, let me off. You been around here before? He asked. I shook my head again. Got family down here? He asked. Not down here, I said. You got family anywhere? He asked. A brother up in DC, I said. Works for the Treasury Department. You got friends down here in Georgia? He asked. No, I said. Finley wrote it down. Then there was a long silence. I knew for the sure what the next question was going to be. So why? He asked. Why get off the bus at an unscheduled stop and walk 14 miles in the rain to a place you had absolutely no reason to go to? That was killer question. Finley had picked up out right away. So would a prosecutor, and I had no real answer. What can I tell you? I said. It was an arbitrary decision. I was restless. I have to be somewhere, right? But why here? He said. I don't know, I said. Guy next to me had a map, and I picked this place out. I wanted to get off the main drags. Thought I could look back down towards the Gulf, farther west maybe. You picked this place out, Finley said. Don't give me that shit. How could you pick this place out? It's just a name. It's just a dot on the map. You must have had a reason. I nodded. I thought I would come and look for Blind Black. I said. Who the hell is Blind Black? He said. I watched him evaluating scenario like a chess computer evaluates move. Was Blind Black my friend, my enemy, my accomplice, conspirator, mentor, creditor, debtor, my next victim? Blind Black was a guitar player, I said. Died 60 years ago, maybe murdered. My brother bought a record. Sleeve note said it happened in Margrave. He wrote me about it. Said he was through here a couple of times in the spring, some kind of business. I thought I would come down and check the story out. Finley looked blank. I must have sounded pretty thin to him. It would have sounded pretty thin to me too, in his position. You came here looking for a guitar player, he said. A guitar player who died 60 years ago. Why? Are you a guitar player? No, I said. How did your brother write you? He asked. When you got no interest. He wrote my old unit, I said. They forward my mail to my bank, where I put my severance pay. They send it on when I wire them for cash. He shook his head, made a note. The midnight Greyhound out of Tampa, right? He said. I nodded. Got your bus ticket? He asked. In the property bag, I guess, I said. I remembered Becker bagging up all my pocket junks, Stevenson taking it. Would the bus driver remember? Finlay said. Maybe, I said. It was a special stop. I had to ask him. I became like a spectator. The situation became abstract. My job had not the difference from Finlay's. I had an odd feeling of conferring with him about someone else's case, like we were colleagues discussing a knotty problem. Why aren't you working? Finlay asked. I shrugged, tried to explain. Because I don't want to work, I said. I worked 13 years, got me nowhere. I feel like I tried it their way, and to hell with them. Now I am going to try it my way. Finlay said and gazed at me. Did you have any trouble in the army? He said. No more than you did in Boston, I said. He was surprised. What do you mean by that? He said. You did 20 years in Boston, I said. That's what you told me, Finley. So why are you down here in this no-account little place? You should be taking your pension, going out fishing, Cape Cod or wherever. What's your story? That's my business, Mr. Richer, he said. Answer my question. I shrugged. Ask the army, I said. I will, he said. You can be damn sure of that. Did you get an honorable discharge? Would they give me severance if I didn't? I said. Why should I believe they gave you a dime? He said. You live like a damn vagrant. Honorable discharge? Yes or no? Yes, I said, of course. He made another note. Thought for a while. How did it make you feel being let go? He asked. I thought about it, shrugged at him. Didn't make me feel like anything, I said. Made me feel like I was in the army and now I'm not in the army. Do you feel bitter? He said. Let down? No, I said. Should I? No problems at all? He asked. Like there had to be something. I felt like I had to give him some kind of an answer, but I couldn't think of anything. I had been in the service since the day I was born. Now I was out. Being out felt great, felt like freedom. Like all my life, I had been a slight headache, not noticing until it was gone. My only problem was making a living. How to make a living without giving up the freedom was not an easy trick. I hadn't earned a cent in 6 months. That was my only problem. But I wasn't about to tell Finley that. He had seen it as a motive. He would think I had decided to bankroll my vagrant lifestyle by robbing people at warehouses and then killing them. I guess the transition is hard to manage, I said, especially since I had the life as a kid too. Finley nodded, considered my answer. Why you in particular? He said. Did you volunteer to muster out? I never volunteer for anything, I said. Soldier's basic rule. Another silence. Did you specialize? He asked. In the service? General duties initially, I said. That's the system. Then I handled secret services for 5 years. Then the last 6 years, I handled something else. Let him ask. What was that? He asked. Homicide investigation, I said. Finley leaned right back, grunted. Did the steepled fingers thing again. He gazed at me and exhaled, sat forward, pointed a finger at me. Right, he said. I am going to check you out. We have got your prints. Those should be on file with the army. We'll get your service record, all of it, all the details. We'll check with the bus company, check your ticket. Find the driver, find the passengers. If what you say is right, we'll know soon enough. And if it isn't true, it may let you off the hook. Obviously, certain details of timing and methodology will determine the matter. Those details are as yet unclear. He paused and exhaled again. Look right at me. In the meantime, I am a cautious man, he said. On the face of it, you look bad, a drifter, a vagrant. No address, no history. Your story may be bullshit. You may be fugitive. You may have been murdering people left and right in a dozen states. I just don't know. I can't be expected to give you the benefit of the doubt. Right now, why should I even have any doubt? You stay locked up until we know for sure, okay? It was what I had expected. It was exactly what I would have said. But I just looked at him and shook my head. You are a cautious guy, I said. That's for damn sure. He looked back at me. If I am wrong, I'll buy you lunch on Monday, he said, at Eno's place to make up for today. I shook my head again. I'm not looking for a buddy down here, I said. Finley just shrugged, clicked off the tape recorder, rewound, took out the tape, wrote on it. He buzzed the intercom on the big rosewood desk, asked Baker to come back in. I waited. It was still cold, but I had finally dried out. The rain had fallen out of the Georgia sky and had soaked into me. Now it has been sucked out again by the drier office air. A dehumidifier has sucked it out and piped it away. Baker knocked and entered. Finlay told him to escort me to the cells. Then he nodded to me. It was a nod which said, if you turn out not to be the guy, remember, I was just doing my job. I nodded back. Mine was a nod which said, while you are covering your ass, there is killer running about outside. The cell block was really just a wide alcove of the main open plan squared room. It was divided into 3 separate cells with vertical bars. The former wall was all bars. A gate section hinged into each cell. The metalwork had a fabulous dull glitter, looked like titanium. Each cell was carpeted, but totally empty. No furniture or bed ledge. Just a high-budget version of the old-fashioned holding pens you used to see. No overnight accommodation here? I asked Baker. No way, he replied. You will be moved to the state facility later. Bus comes by at 6. Bus brings you back Monday. He clanged the gate shut and turned his key. I heard bolts socket home all around the rim, electric. I took the newspaper out of my pocket, took off my coat and rolled it up, lay flat on the floor and crammed the coat under my head. Now I was truly pissed off. I was going to prison for the weekend. I wasn't staying in a station house cell. Not that I had any other plan, but I knew about civilian prisons. A lot of army deserters end up in civilian prisons for one thing or another. The system notifies the army. Military policemen get sent to bring them back. So I'll see civilian prisons. They didn't make me wild with enthusiasm. I lay angrily listening to the hum of the squared room. Phone rang. Keyboard splattered. The tempo rose and fell. Officers moved about, talking low. Then I tried to finish reading the borrowed newspaper. It was full of shit about the president and his campaign to get himself elected once again for a second term. The old guy was down in Pensacola on the Gulf Coast. He was aiming to get the budget balanced before his grandchildren's hair turned white. He was cutting things like a guy with a machete blasting his way through the jungle. Down in Pensacola, he was sticking it to the Coast Guard. They would be running an initiative for the last 12 months. They would been out in the force like a curved shield of Florida's coast every day for a year, boarding and searching all the marine traffic they didn't like the smell of. It had been announced with enormous fanfare, and it had been successful beyond their wildest dreams. They had seized all kind of stuff, drugs mostly, but guns as well, illegal migrants from Haiti and Cuba. The interdiction was reducing crime all over the states months later, and thousands of miles further down the line, a big success. So it was being abandoned. It was very expensive to run. The Coast Guard's budget was into serious deficit. The president said he couldn't increase it. In fact, he had have to cut it. The economy was in a mess. Nothing else he could do. So the interdiction initiative would be cancelled in 7 days' time. The president was trying to come across like a statesman. Law enforcement big shots were angry because they figured prevention was better than cure. Washington insiders were happy because 50 cents spent on a bed cop was much more visible than $2 spent on the ocean 2,000 miles away from the waters. The arguments flew back and forth, and in the smudgy photographs, the president was just beaming away like a statesman saying there was nothing he could do. I stopped reading because it was just making me angrier. To calm down, I ran music through my head, the chorus in Smokestack Lightning. The howling wolf Vervin put a wonderfully strangled cry on the end of the first line. They say you need to ride the rails for a while to understand the traveling blues. They are wrong. To understand the traveling blues, you need to be locked down somewhere, in a cell or in the army, some place where you are caged, some place where Smokestack Lightning looks like a faraway beacon of impossible freedom. I lay there with my coat as a pillow and listened to the music in my head. In the end of the third chorus, I fell asleep. I woke up again when Baker started kicking the bars. They made a dull ringing sound, like a funeral bell. Baker stood there with Finley. They looked down at me. I stayed on the floor. I was comfortable down there. Where did you say you were at midnight last night? Finley asked me. Getting on the bus in Tampa, I said. We have got a new witness, Finley said. He saw you at the warehouse facility last night, hanging around at midnight. Total crap, Finley. I said. Impossible. Who the hell is this new witness? The witness is Chief Morrison, Finley said. The chief of police. He says he was sure he had seen you before. Now he has remembered where.